Hello and welcome to another episode of Learning to Live in the Present Moment. My name is Ted Robinson and I'm your host today. Today we're going to be talking about a book that I've recently been reading. It's called 50 Spiritual Classics. And it's by Tom Butler-Bowdon. Tom Butler-Bowdon. He has a number of books called 50 Ways or 50 of this, 50 of that. It's always a review of 50 classical books in some area or other. But this one really interested me because it's 50 spiritual classics. And I said, what would that be? What would the 50 spiritual classics possibly be? So I started reading from the middle of the book, as I tend to do sometimes, just to see if I'm going to like the book. And then I read another part, and then a different part, and then another part. Before long, I had read a good portion of the book, and then I said, well, maybe I ought to go back to the beginning of the book and see what the introduction says. And what I discovered was it said a lot of things that I've been talking about here on this show for years now. And my ego was very happy to be confirmed by somebody else. Oh, look at that. Those are the most important books, and I've been reading those books. Look how happy my ego can be. And the reason I say that is because I am not my ego, nor are you, but my ego is what tends to drive a lot of my behaviors. So I'm purposely saying things like, look at how happy my ego was because this book confirmed the 50 classics, and I've read a number of them. Does it really matter? Is it because somebody else chose 50 classics? Not really. But what did matter to me was the fact that the conclusions that were drawn were very similar to what I've finally concluded, which is ultimately we are all one. And ultimately we are not just one single person making their way in the world the best they can and having all these trials and tribulations, but we are all one being, part of God. We are all part of God. Every religion adheres to that premise as well, that we are all part of God, that God is omnipresent, meaning everywhere all the time, and so I can't even escape if I wanted to. You can't either. An agnostic or an atheist cannot escape God. They are simply God, because everything's God. But what the book told me, and what I have confirmed on my own, was that people tend to come into this world, in this incarnation, this lifetime, with a certain question being asked of them, a certain goal to be met. Maybe it's to experience forgiveness or compassion. Maybe it's to experience suffering. I don't know what yours is or what even mine is. I know that I'm living my life and certain things are happening in my life and have happened in my life, and they have directed me in certain directions. For example, when I was in my early 40s, I was 42, suddenly I finished the trial. I'm a trial lawyer. And I had this terrible inability to breathe. I thought, well, something's wrong. I went to the hospital. They couldn't figure it out. I didn't know what it was. They didn't know what it was. What do I do now? So I went to another doctor, and another doctor, and another, and another. And finally I realized the doctors don't have my solution. I went to a chiropractor, and that helped. And so I kept going there. And in the waiting room, I found A Course in Miracles, which brought me into spirituality. And that took me on a whole course through Reiki and eventually hypnosis and emotional freedom technique until I finally have arrived at presence. And this has been part of my journey, I realized. Out of that horrible, terrible experience. I mean, I couldn't walk 10 paces, 10 steps, without having to stop and catch my breath. I couldn't walk up 3 steps on a stairway without having to catch my breath. It was just horrific. I was 42 in the prime of my life, and it was just about dead. What happened was, the life that I had been living before, a lot of partying, a lot of enjoying, and a lot of accumulation, just left. And I was struggling to keep holding on to life. And as a result of that, I turned to a deeper part. I looked for a goal of some sort of salvation. I was desperate. And so I found spirituality, the Course in Miracles. And even then, it didn't completely resolve it. It's not completely resolved to this day. But I've learned to live with it. And I know that my life has changed dramatically because of that terrible, terrible event in my life. My life has suddenly turned around completely. I'm dedicated to spirituality and spiritual growth. I'm dedicated to sharing it with others, as I'm doing now. So what I'm getting at here is we don't always know what's happening in our life. We think we do. I'm going to go and work my tail off until I buy a house. I'm going to have a spouse and a family, and everything's going to be great. And all of a sudden it turns to mud. But out of the mud grows other things, just like for me. I thought I was having a great time. I was dating this one, that one. Everything was fine. I was having lots of parties. Everything was wonderful. I was riding high until all of a sudden, boom. And everything they just pulled the rug out from under me. Can't breathe. What do you do then? So I turned more and more and more towards healing, learning healing, and then spirituality. And ultimately, presence. And the reason I do this show is to share with you the conclusion that I've come to. And that's what this show is entitled to. It's called Learning to Live in the Present Moment. I'll be right back to tell you more about that, but just watch this for now. Welcome back. So, why am I taking the time to share this with you? Because I want you to realize what I didn't realize for the first 42, probably 50 years of my life. That there is a beautiful aspect of life awaiting everyone all the time. But as long as we are caught up in our ego mind, which we've all been conditioned to be in, by the way, and the ego mind, let me define that for you so you understand what I'm speaking about. The ego mind is the thinking mind. And it's quite simple. If you're thinking, cogitating, figuring it all out, if you're thinking about the past, remembering all kinds of stuff, perhaps resenting, being frustrated, being angry, being enraged, or just being sad. Or if you're thinking about the future and being worried, anxious, and stressed, all of these things are the ego. If you get caught up in judgment, if you judge that I'm an idiot because I'm saying such a thing, or he doesn't know what he's talking about, that's judgment, that's the ego. If you if you determine that everybody else is wrong but you're right, that's the ego, right? Now, the ego is not entirely bad, don't misunderstand me. I tend to come across that way sometimes, and it's not true. Because we all need the ego to help us make choices in life. If you don't judge the red dress from the blue dress, you won't know which one to wear. If you don't know which tie to put on, you won't know which to wear. You won't know what to pick out when you're in a diner or when you're going in a food market. Which pasta do I choose? Which vegetable do I choose? These are all things of judgment, right? Acts of judgment. So we need the ego, and there's nothing wrong with the ego. But when we get too invested in the ego, when we get too caught up in what the ego is saying or doing, then we're lost many times, most times. And the only answer to all of that, and by the way, we have been conditioned all of our lives, from school to religion to politics to the justice system, all of it is based in judgment. Now, let me explain why. And the ego. When you first went to school, we were required to memorize. You started with your ABCs, they gave you a little song to sing. with your times tables, with all kinds of different things. And history is all about recalling facts, usually pretty dry facts, right? Not very interesting facts. And we don't have much use for those things, we think. And so we just memorize them to try to get a good mark in a test. So what? We can get a little pat on the head or a gold star, or we get our butts paddled because our parents are frustrated because we didn't study. That's the conditioning of which I'm speaking. When we get conditioned in that fashion, we learn to run everything through our minds before we make decisions, before we make choices. So when we do make a choice, we always run it through our mind first. That's conditioned response to use your thinking brain. You might say, well, what's wrong with that? What's wrong with thinking? Absolutely nothing. But there's a much wiser and smarter part of you, mind, and you, that you can count on much more capably. And that's your subconscious mind. It's the thinker that has no thoughts. I'll give you an example. When you go to bed at night, have you ever had a problem and wake up with the answer in the morning? That's your subconscious at work. When you can't remember something, the name of that tune is, and you can't remember it, you say, oh, I'm going to move on to something else, and 5 minutes later, bam, there's the name of the song, or the name of the person, or the experience that you were trying to remember, or something that you were trying to remember on your list of things to do. The mind is a very interesting thing. And so the subconscious is where everything, the real power is. The ego is in the conscious mind. So what happens is we get so conditioned to using our conscious mind, we try to figure everything out and think it through. And we filter all of our decision making and our choices through the conscious mind. And that's not the smartest part of our mind. The smartest part is the subconscious, which is the part that really gives us bursts of spiritual knowing and knowledge that we never knew we had. Many times people make a remark just offhanded, and it's brilliant, right? It's profound. How did you get that? Where did that come from? Oh, I don't know, I just thought of it. That's the thoughts without thinking. That's the subconscious mind. But if you try to figure out, let me see, I'll try to figure it all out here and look for all the different variations and combinations. Sometimes it works, quite often it works, but it's not as smart as the subconscious mind. And the subconscious mind is where you eventually come to presence. Now, here's the deal. You cannot be present while your conscious mind is active. If you're thinking, your conscious mind is active. If you're caught up in the past or future, your conscious mind is active. If you're caught up in judgment of any nature, your conscious mind is active. All of those things preclude you from being present. So what? Well, remember, the show is called Learning to Live in the Present Moment. And the reason for that is because, going back to where I originally started, after I struggled with all these various things for all these many years, and I'm now 67, from 42, that's 25 years. For 25 years I've been struggling to find my way through, to find what's the answer, what's the solution. And so I've been sharing it on this show. And the answer is obviously the title to this show, which is Learning to Live in the Present Moment. Why? Because the present moment is the ultimate place, in my view, in my conclusion, from my judgment, I'll give you that. My ego has judged this to be the best place to be, ultimately. It's ironic because if I'm in presence, I can't be in the ego. But there's a certain part of me, a certain higher part of me that knows that presence is truly the answer. So I'll be back in just a few moments to tell you more. Don't go away. Welcome back. So part of the book that I've been talking about, this 50 spiritual classics, has an introduction, like I told you. And the introduction is very, very interesting because he sort of pulls all these 50 classics, and he drew these 50 classics from as early as hundreds of years before Christ and up until recent times, as Eckhart Tolle. And Eckhart Tolle, as I've spoken about on this show many times, is the one who talks about presence, as well as Leonard Jacobson, who's been my teacher for many years. So when he finally draws this whole thing together, he does a really good synopsis of the whole thing. And it comes down to, we come here as incarnated spirits. We come here as a soul to inhabit this body. Your body is inhabited by a soul. It's not that you are a body with a mind that has a soul. It's quite the reverse. We are a spirit that we've incarnated into this density we call our body, that has a mind, that develops an ego. But the purpose of being here is the question I've asked many times in this show. Why are we here? Who are we? What are we doing here? The answer really comes down, we come here with a question. And our life is to become the answer. So what happens is, I got sick, I got very ill, and I turned to this. Maybe if I stopped thinking about it and trying to figure it all out and stop working it out in my mind, maybe I come to the realization or the recognition that this was God's plan, Spirit's plan, the divine's plan for me all along. Maybe this was just the point at which I would eventually evolve to because of past experiences and past lives. I don't know. But I've come to a realization. I'm willing to not need to know any longer. It doesn't matter. I'm here. I'm doing this now. At some time previous in my life, I was doing something different. I was a sculptor at one time. And that was what I was so invested in. I've got to make these beautiful sculptures. I'm not doing that now. I'm doing this. And that goes back to one of the other programs I've already done, which is we have different outer purposes throughout our life, and it changes from time to time. Our outer purpose for me was one time I was a student, then I was a sculptor, then I became an attorney. Now I'm teaching. And I'm teaching presence because for me, after all this time here on earth, I finally have come to the conclusion that this is the best thing for me to teach because it's the best place for me to be, in presence. I have found so much comfort and so much beauty, peace, and love in presence that I want to share it with others. Because I don't think enough people know about this yet. I certainly didn't learn it from my religious training. I didn't learn it from a lot of things. I eventually had to learn it by getting very ill and being desperate. I knew I was facing death at the time. I was desperate. I came back to presence. And it wasn't the only time I faced death. I also had spinal meningitis about 10 or 12 years ago. And I still came back to presence. It always comes back to presence for me. May not be for you in this lifetime. It's okay. But if you'd like to evolve your life, if you'd like to come towards presence, then watch what I'm saying and apply it to your life. I can tell you this, as long as your ego is predominant in your life, you cannot be present. It's just that simple. Because you can't quiet the chattering mind of the ego long enough to just be present. And by the way, presence isn't just sitting here in silence like this. It's not just that. You can be walking down the street in presence. You can be playing ball in presence. That's right. As long as you're in that zone where you're not trying to figure it all out and work it all out and run it through that mind all the time. Well, if I do this, then I can do that. That's not presence. Presence is just allowing life to unfold in its own perfection and just being here with it. And that you can do in almost any state. Just being. You can drive in presence, although I don't recommend it. I do it every once in a while. And I open my viewpoint up so I can actually use my peripheral vision to see things coming from the sides. Most of us are so focused on the front we can't see much to the sides because our ego wants to be in control and It focuses our vision. In presence, we are more allowing, so I can see all the way out to here. And it's been very helpful to me at times. The same is true when you're walking. The same is true when you're just eating, or when you're just being silent or quiet. I believe that God's voice comes to each and every one of us when we are quiet enough to hear it. I believe the voice of God, the voice of Spirit, the universal intelligence, whatever you want to call it, is always talking to us. Sometimes it comes as simple intuition. I know that when I'm working with a group here, I can feel their level. We call it a SUDS, a subjective unit of discomfort scale, between 0 and 10. And because it's subjective, everybody has a different scale. But I can actually feel people's scale, where they are in their scale, because I stop thinking about it. And that knowing part of my mind just takes over, and I go, oh, you're a 5 or you're a 7. And invariably, I'm just within a point, or I'm dead on each time. And it's not because I'm so smart or so great at this. It's just that I've learned to quiet my mind enough that I can feel it. And you can do this too. Many people can do this. They don't recognize that they're doing it, but they're doing it. Have you ever had an intuition about somebody? You either love them or you hate them the first time you meet them? That's probably what you're talking about. It's that knowing, the inner knowing about this person. You see them for who they really are. You know them. You don't have to think it over. And many times you've been misled by people. I know I have. When I thought everything was just great. Then later on you find that, wow, I misread that completely. The next time I'll use my intuition. I won't think so much. You ever say that? I have. And that's the idea. The thinking mind is the ego mind. And as long as you're caught up in the past, future, or in judgment, and I mean caught up in it, you just can't escape it. And every time you try to be quiet, the mind just keeps chattering away. That's being caught up in it. You can't be present in those situations. But when you finally let go of all that, when you can finally be quiet within yourself, that doesn't mean you have to sit in silence, although it can help. You may start out in silence, but you can eventually just be here now. That's what it really comes down to. And by the way, this is not alien to us. As little infants, we were just here. Remember the little infant that you've seen sitting in the crib looking up? And I mention this a lot on this show because those children are present. It's a natural state for us to be in. We've just learned to compete. We got to be a driving competitor. You know, as my friend says, you don't play the game if you're not going to keep score, because what's the point? Maybe the point's just to play, not to the ego. The ego, you have to keep score, otherwise what's the point? How will we know who won? That's the ego too. And there's nothing wrong with the ego. There's nothing wrong with winning, and there's nothing wrong with playing to win. The only thing that's needed here is to become aware. I call it the watcher. The watcher sits up here and watches the whole thing happen. If you can just see yourself being caught up in your ego, then you're no longer caught up. You're the observer. You're the watcher of the ego. And the interesting thing about the ego is as soon as it realizes it's being watched, it draws back. It doesn't want to be seen because it knows what it's doing is not right. Ultimately, it knows. It goes, oh, whoops, pulls back, retracts. So when you start to become the watcher, when you start to observe yourself and your ego, then you know you're starting to become present. I like to start by becoming silent first and then venturing out to the world. You may do it a different way, it's your choice. But when you can start to see your ego for what it is as it's doing it, then you know that you're observing your ego. And the ego has no place to hide anymore. And the ego will suddenly, all on its own, it'll pull back because it doesn't want to be seen. It wants to do its thing, but it doesn't want to be seen as such. Now, there'll be arrogant egos that say, hey, I don't care who sees me. Go ahead, so watch all you like. But eventually, it gets seen enough. It withdraws, it retracts, it pulls back. And that's the idea. So all you need to do ultimately is just become the watcher of the ego. And again, you become the watcher by becoming present. In presence, you'll see everything happening at once and not do anything. You don't have to do anything about it. You can just watch it. Oh, not, oh, look at that. Just, look at that. And you'll notice things. You'll notice it as it happens. And that's what you want. You want to notice stuff as it happens. And the more you notice, the more you'll see the ego. As you see the ego doesn't want to be seen. It'll go pull back in and won't come back out for a while until it knows it's safe from the watcher. If you get distracted, if you're over here someplace, ego can pop right back out again, do its little deeds, and then you come back, oops, and it draws back. All of this comes from presence. And then what happens ultimately is instead of always turning back into the thinking mind to try to figure out what should I do now, how should I do it, the answers will just come naturally, easily, effortlessly, because you don't have to think everything over so strongly all the time. You don't have to always turn back to the mind. You can just know. And that knowing will be of a universal context. You'll know everything. And things will go much easier in your life. And that's when life starts to calm down. The dramas start to dissipate. Peace, tranquility, compassion, love, gratitude all start to show up in your life automatically. And you just feel better being alive. That's what this show is all about. That's the message of that book I was showing you, this book, 50 Spiritual Books. Because that's been what the true masters who have been writing about this all these centuries, millennia, have been saying. Ultimately, that's the answer. And that's why this show exists. That's why I'm giving you these talks. Because I'm working this out myself. This is what I'm working out. And I thought perhaps maybe I'd share it with you so you didn't have to wait until you're my age to work it out. Or maybe you're already past my age and you want to work it out. Whenever you do, it's fine. And if you don't work it out in this lifetime, it's okay too. You'll come back again and do it all over again. And maybe then you'll remember to work it out. It's just how it works. It always works out. Eventually everything's going to be fine. So I just want to remind you that we have a borrowing benefits group here at our Center for Inner Healing, which is located at 26 St. Paul's Place in Hempstead, New York, 11550. And we do that every Wednesday night from 7 to 9 p.m. It's $20 and everybody's welcome. Even beginners are welcome. And we do some very deep work with all this stuff, and people really get it. When they leave here, they feel very different than when they walked in the front door. That I know for sure. We also do a thing called a Sunday night tapathon at 7 p.m. on Sunday nights. And if you want to go to our website, which is centerforinnerhealing.com, Center for, spelled out F-O-R, innerhealing.com, you'll find the tapathon on one of the pages there under EFT, I believe it is, because EFT is what we do, Emotional Freedom Technique. And you'll get the number for that. And we're going to Google Plus in the future for Google Hangouts, and we'll be doing them on the computer, so that'll be free for everybody to participate. So take a look at those things and check out our website. I think you'll find a lot of information there that'll help you. It's all about presence, hypnosis, and EFT, and learning to live in the present moment. So we'll see you next time, same place, as we learn to live in the present moment together. Have a wonderful day.